So good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's book talk about Newshawks in Berlin, the Associated Press in Nazi Germany, which is part of this year's New York Jewish Book Festival. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, that you will visit the museum in person, especially this weekend for the rest of the 2024 New York Jewish Book Festival. We also have one more virtual event as part of the festival tomorrow, which is a discussion of the book, The Chief Rabbi's Funeral. So you can find more information about both the in-person and the virtual events on the museum's website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are so honored to be joined by Randy Herschaft, Ann Cooper, and Pamela Sampson. Randy has been for the past 3 decades an investigative journalist with the Associated Press, the recipient of a George Polk Award and an Overseas Press Club Award. He was a member of the Pulitzer Prize-winning AP team that nearly 50 years later uncovered a massacre of civilians by U.S. troops during the Korean War. In 2014, he was part of the investigative team that uncovered U.S. Social Security payments that were being made to suspected Nazi war criminals, even after their expulsion from the United States. As a result of their reporting, Congress passed a law called the No Social Security for Nazis Act, and it was signed by President Barack Obama to stop the Social Security payments to Nazi war criminals. The Holocaust is personal to Randy. His great uncle was deported from France to Auschwitz and never seen again. Anne is a professor emerita in the Columbia Journalism School. She is the former executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists and was a foreign correspondent for NPR, including serving as Moscow bureau chief from 1987 to 1991. Pamela is an editor and former foreign correspondent for the Associated Press. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other publications. She is the author of No Reply, A Jewish Child Aboard the MS St. Louis and the Ordeal That Followed. So we have a very distinguished panel with us today. You can buy Newshawks in Berlin at the link in the chat, and there's also a 20% off code, so make sure that you make use of that. So thank you so much for joining us today, and now I'm going to hand things over to our speakers.
Good evening. The era of the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million European Jews during World War II, began in January 1933, when the radically anti-Semitic Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. Jews were stripped of their rights, of their citizenship, and of their property. They were banned from schools and banned from practicing most professions. They were dismissed from jobs and forced into poverty. Jewish officers were expelled from the army, and Jewish university students were not allowed to sit for doctoral exams. Step by step, the Jews were isolated from mainstream society, and as time went on, the persecution became more extreme. Kristallnacht, commonly known as the Night of Broken Glass, was to some scholars the event that marked the actual beginning of the Holocaust. During Kristallnacht on November 9th through 10th, 1938, German stormtroopers and Hitler Youth unleashed a pogrom against Jews in Germany and Austria. Hundreds of synagogues were set on fire, the storefronts of Jewish businesses were shattered, homes and businesses were ransacked, and 30,000 Jewish men were arrested for no reason. The persecution eventually spread beyond Germany's borders as its army conquered new territory. Special killing squads followed the troops into Eastern Europe with the express purpose of murdering Jews. As many as 2 million Jews died in this sweep, and 1,500 villages were erased from the map. Eventually, as part of the final solution, extermination camps were established to make the killing more efficient. Large gas chambers and crematoria were built to kill the victims and burn their bodies. By the end of the war, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population was wiped out. For the American public, the single most important source of news was the Associated Press. Ann Cooper is here today to speak about the vital role the AP played in keeping Americans informed and Randy's presentation will show some of the coverage that AP was involved in. Randy will also discuss some of the ethical compromises the AP made in order to stay in business in Berlin. For example, withholding photos that the Nazis might not approve of. And with that, I'd like to turn over the microphone to Anne.
Thank you so much, Pam. So Newshawks in Berlin is not the first book to address the issue of how American media covered Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, but it is the first book to closely examine how the Associated Press covered that story. And as Pam has just mentioned, AP was so important. Its coverage was really crucial. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. And why it's so surprising that, you know, this is the first time that AP's coverage has been examined in this way. But first, I want to mention another book that probably a lot of people are familiar with, Deborah Lipstadt's Beyond Belief, which also looked at how media had covered Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, but, you know, kind of looking much more broadly at US media coverage. That phrase, the title, Beyond Belief, is just so apt because it describes one of the dilemmas that journalists faced as they were trying to cover this story. You know, they could, and much of what Pam described, they were there, they were eyewitnesses, they could go out and do reporting in the early years, and up through Kristallnacht, there was incredible reporting of the events that happened over those 2 days. But then, you know, the US and Germany went to war with each other. All the American correspondents were thrown out. It was impossible to do much reporting at all. But stories where things were becoming increasingly dire within Germany and the lands that it invaded, and stories were coming out about mass executions, about gas chambers, and these stories were so horrific as to be beyond belief, hence that title. You know, how can I believe this? And unfortunately, how can I verify this? This was really beyond the ability in many cases of journalists at that time. It's a little hard to imagine that today because we're awash in, you know, photos and videos and stories from all over the world documenting atrocities, you know, showing what's happening in conflict zones. But we have to remember what things were like then. Of course, there was no internet, there was no TV, radio was in its infancy in the 30s and 40s. So imagine if you lived in America at that time, where were you finding out what was happening in the rest of the world? Your source of news was your hometown newspaper. And the odds are very good, no matter where you lived, that your hometown newspaper was one of the 1,200 or so that subscribed to the Associated Press. And that's why I say it's kind of surprising that, you know, this is the first time that there's been a really close examination of how AP covered this story, because in that era, AP, hands down, was the most important source of international news for American newspaper readers. And of course, that means it was the most important source of news about Nazi Germany. So imagine, you know, what was happening with other newspapers around the country. The Chicago Tribune, which did have a correspondent in Nazi Germany, had about 1 million circulation. So the stories that correspondent wrote could be seen by, you know, 1 million people, and then whoever else, you know, if whoever else in the family saw the newspaper or however it was passed on. People in New York, people in Seattle or San Francisco, they're not seeing those Chicago Tribune stories. So it was very limited compared to the reach of AP, because one story going out on the AP wire had the potential to reach millions, tens of millions of newspaper readers around the country. And I emphasize that word potential because AP is not a publisher. It did not publish the stories that were produced by the Berlin Bureau. It reported the news, it put it out on the wire, it distributed all of its stories to these 1,200 subscriber newspapers. And then someone else took over making decisions about, is this story going to run? How much of it are we going to run? Because often there was a 6-inch hole in the newspaper. And so if the story was 12 inches long, they would just cut it right in the middle and throw away the bottom half. And where are we going to run it? Is it going to be splashed on page 1? Or is it going to be, you know, back with the comics on, you know, D13 or something like that? So to assess AP coverage of Nazi Germany means not just looking at the stories that AP produced, that its AP reporting bureau in Berlin produced, but what the subscriber newspapers did with each one of those stories. And that, as you're going to hear a lot more about from Randy, could be very different. Could be on page 1, could be a banner headline. Maybe another newspaper in another city didn't run it at all, or somebody else ran it, you know, buried inside the newspaper. But regardless of how these stories got played, AP's decisions on what to cover and how to cover it were really crucial to how America understood Nazi Germany. And those decisions were overseen first and foremost by AP's Berlin bureau chief, a guy named Louis Lochner, who had terrific qualifications for the job. He grew up speaking German. He was American, but his parents were German, so that's what they spoke at home. He had lived in Germany for some years and had contacts all over the place, high and low, government, opposition, religious leaders. You know, Louis Lochner kind of knew everybody. The rest of the bureau consisted of 2 German reporters and then several other Americans who were mostly men who had done a great job covering the Midwest. And then they landed in Berlin and were thrown into a story like no other that American journalists had ever had to cover. So in putting this book together, Randy and my late husband, Larry Heinzerling, who partnered on this project, and I, who helped get it through the final stages to publication, we read hundreds, Randy probably read thousands of stories that the AP reporters put out from that bureau. They were writing in a very restrictive environment. They were forced often to self-censor, to tone down a story, sometimes to not cover it at all, or to bury the lead, put it way down in the story, because they didn't want to get thrown out of the country, because once they were thrown out, or once you left Germany, that was it. Again, you didn't have the tools that we have today where you can still do some meaningful reporting from exile, as, for example, independent Russian journalists are doing right now. Despite all those restrictions, all 3 of us were very impressed at just how comprehensive AP's coverage was, and in particular on the crucial story of the fate of Europe's Jews. Yes, there were stories that were underplayed. There were stories that did not get written, or you know, were played in different ways, written in different ways. But from the earliest days of Nazi rule, AP's Berlin bureau was writing about Jews targeted for physical attack, the laws that robbed Jews of property and rights. AP wrote about the creation of concentration camps and Jewish ghettos, and about Nazi officials, including Hitler, and their calls for exterminating Europe's Jews, and also about the implementation of the final solution. Not every one of those 1,200 newspapers carried all those stories or carried them in full. But as one academic put it years later, looking back at this coverage, Americans knew the scope of the Nazi menace as it unfolded, because the American public itself read in its morning and evening newspapers that the Jews were being wiped out. And many, many of the stories that told them that were stories that were written by the Associated Press and its Berlin bureau. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Anne. And now we'll switch to the visual presentation portion and Randy Herschaft.
Hi, thank you, Pam. Thanks, Anne, and thank you, Sydney Yeager, for hosting us at your book festival. So I'd just like to start with the origins of the book. The employees at AP were startled in 2016 when German historian Harry Scheinberg wrote an academic article saying that AP ceded its photo influence to the Nazi propagandists from 1933 to 1941. Schomburg also revealed that the Nazis were abusing AP photographs in uncompromising ways to promote their virulent anti-Semitism with no protests from the AP. And Harry also revealed for the first time a dedicated Nazi photographer for the AP, Franz Roth. So AP decided that these are serious allegations, and they appointed Larry Heinzerling and I to take a look, warts and all. So we came up with a report after a 6-month investigation. But there were still unanswered questions. There were still gaps in this mosaic of truly understanding how AP operated in Nazi Germany. So Larry and I wanted to take a deeper dive. We spent 4 years in investigating this, and we accumulated a lot of new material. And also, for the first time, we compiled a chapter on how AP covered the unveiling of the Holocaust. This hasn't been written before, and we made an attempt at that. But it's truly fascinating because there's a lot of internal discussions that we were able to review and write about, where there were dissenting opinions within AP of hiring this Nazi photographer. And there was even the head of the AP Photo Bureau, who was AP's moral compass, Gideon Seymour, even went as far that AP should close its photo bureau if it insists on obliging the propaganda ministry in putting out dishonest captions. Unfortunately, Seymour left in 1937, and the photo operation was compromised because it was under German law, and the photo subsidiary was under German law, and we had to operate that way. Okay, so let me just show you a photo montage that illustrates a lot of these issues. I'm gonna share screen. 1 second. Okay. Oops, 1 second. Okay, so this photo illustrates is a harbinger of how AP operated in Nazi Germany. This was in March 1933, even before the propaganda ministry was set up. Louis Lachner, the bureau chief, decided not to purchase this photo of a Jewish attorney being paraded in the streets. This was a familiar mantra from Lachner throughout his time. His argument was that it may cause the Germans to to expel AP from Germany. So this represented caution, and AP was cautious because of the possible retribution that it faced. So this was a very controversial decision that was taken, but it was a harbinger of things to come. So this is an example in another paper that ran the picture on page 1 in their paper. Okay, so as Anne discussed, Louis Lochner was the bureau. He was the bureau chief for AP. He was the constant. So there were 2 constants. Louis Lochner, the bureau chief from 28 to 41, and he was head of the foreign bureau, the Foreign Writers Bureau Association for 6 years, the Chamber of Commerce for 3 years. But he relentlessly wrote about the Jewish problem. I'd say he gets a big thumbs up in his coverage of the persecution of the Jews in Nazi Germany up through the war when AP was expelled and our journalists were interned. The reason why he was able to cover the Jewish issues is he wrote that so blind were the Nazis in their hatred of the Jews that they had less objection to truthful reporting on anti-Semitic measures and actions than on almost any other manifestation of Nazi regimented German life, he wrote. Okay, and so he wrote a lot about the Jews throughout, and we'll see some examples of that. So Ken Cooper was also the other key player here. He was AP's general manager. His obituary, written by AP, termed him as a one-man show at AP, who had tremendous influence. In 1931, AP was basically a domestic news service. They were only able to sell to newspapers in the United States because they participated in this this cartel that didn't allow them to sell their articles outside of the U.S. So Cooper wanted to get an entry to break through with that, and he purchased a photo bureau in Berlin, which wasn't covered by this cartel, and they can sell news photos worldwide. So he saw this Berlin operation as an opportunity to transform AP from a domestic news agency to one of the greatest worldwide news agencies. And his actions were based on that. The photo bureau was operated. The photo bureau was under the Nazi propaganda ministry, and they had to follow German law. And Ken Cooper said that AP should obey all local rules, including censoring the news when demanded. And we write that in the book. He also made his view that journalists should obey the rules of countries where they worked, even when they ran against ethical principles. So the photo bureau was like a cash cow for the AP. It helped subsidize the news operation in Berlin and Europe. So for Cooper, the business was prioritized over journalism ethics. This is in 1933. AP wasn't afraid to publish this photo of the first big boycott against Jewish businesses. So here's an article that the New York Times ran the AP story in 1933 of Nazi attacks on Americans. So this is an example of like the anonymous AP showing up in many papers across the country, where the AP is the backbone of, because 1,200 newspapers that they served didn't have foreign correspondents in Berlin. So AP served that purpose. And here's an example, even the New York Times. So in 35, AP had to dismiss its Jewish employees. The editor's law in 33 only allowed journalists to be Aryans and not Jews. So AP fought to have the Jews on the staff. It worked through 35. And we see here an example of one of the most famous photojournalists for AP was Alfred Eisenstadt, who was referred to as the father of photojournalism. And in this AP article in 1935, he's referred to as the AP ace cameraman. And then we see one of his famous iconic pictures of in VJ Day of the sailor kissing the nurse. So this is Kristallnacht, one of the most important stories in Germany. So what's important about the AP photos that were sent out? So they took over 100 photos. They were arrested like every half hour trying to get to do the photos. But what is significant in these photos is that the photos represent, they only show the physical destruction of property. Not one picture shows the physical assault against the Jews. Therefore, we know the day as like Kristallnacht, the breaking of the glass, the destruction of physical property. But historians also refer to it as the pogrom. Because there were physical assaults against the Jews, but we don't see that in the images that came out. The AP was able to send out 6 images. They became iconic images because of the influence that it had in mobilizing American opinion. Here's another picture that we had access to the AP London Photo Library, and this is an uncropped photo that had never been seen before, with the top right security men looking on in the picture. This is a very interesting, so none of the AP photos that were published identified which photographer took them, but this is the only one that had the initials for the Jewish photographer who was not in business, was not working, and wasn't to be seen. But it's fascinating to think that he came out of the woodwork to document these, like a Kristallnacht. His initial is on the caption in the back on this photo. And all these AP photos appeared on front pages of the American papers. Like here's an example, the Dallas Morning News on the front page. And this is Life magazine published those 3 AP photos, and they boasted of publishing the best of the few photos that seep through the censorship. So only in the back of the paper did it identify the photos as the AP, so the anonymous AP providing its service to American newspapers and magazines. At AP headquarters in New York, Lochner is recognized for his reporting from Berlin in 1938. So here's an example when I said Harry Schomburg identified that the Nazis were using photos of uncompromising ways. Here's one of LaGuardia, whose mother was a Jewish Italian, and the Nazis were using these unflattering pictures. One thing that we learned in the book is another dubious figure that the AP Photo Bureau hired, who was the brother of the editor of the Schwarzkopf, which is a notorious SS publication that outed Jews in 35. The AP had hired him 37 to 39, and we see the sales of these pictures to the Nazi publications. They were abused, and only recently did AP say that they did say that it was a mistake that when it was brought to their attention that AP should have protested, and they'll never allow these things to happen again, where it goes where AP just kept quiet when it was happening. This is the most controversial AP employee, Franz Roth. He was the Nazi photographer. So the interesting thing here is when Harry Schomburg wrote about him that he was an ardent Nazi, and AP confirmed that he did have strong sympathies and allegiance to the Nazi Party. The AP removed 80 all of his digital images that were online on the AP archive website available to the public. There were 80 of them. They removed them, and there are those within AP who feel that AP should reconsider and make them available to be transparent, so that so that people can see what it was that he was photographing and publishing. That the AP position was he was compromised, and they removed them. But there are those within AP who feel that that AP that AP didn't want to get any revenue from it. But there are those within AP who feel that AP could donate any revenues from it to give to a Holocaust organization. So now you have like an issue with, in Israel and October 7 with photography that was taken, which no matter who took it, it documented the atrocities that took place. And I'm not aware that AP has removed any, which is the right decision. And similarly, it should be here too, that, I mean, this is how many years ago, many decades ago. And, historians, academics should be able to, to learn to see what kind of photos that he took. So one of the AP journalists got the first Western tour of the Polish ghettos, Steinkopf. So this is, he took a picture of this is the first picture of the ghetto wall in Warsaw that the New York Times published with the headline, a wall in Warsaw built by Hitler, crediting AP. So we can see other pictures of his trip. On the right-hand side, the train car had separated seating for Jews and non-Jews. But what's interesting of the other photos is that you have these like children who are in front of the camera and smiling, and it kind of like appears, to be a little, propagandist, because it puts it doesn't show the destitution and the hunger and things that was also happening at the time. And the bottom left is kind of like a chutzpah picture. You have this German officer who's teaching good health hygiene to the Jewish children. And this paper made note of that it was hypocritical, and that's not what was happening. So one of the AP photographers who also worked with the Ministry of Propaganda in some projects, he was able to get into Nazi-occupied Europe, and in Lithuania, he took pictures with Jews that were marked with the J. So these are important pictures, and even though our photo department was under, the propaganda ministry edicts, we still were able to get out some good pictures to document what was going on to the Jews. This is a fascinating picture. This was in 1941 of Jews being led, elderly women being led to the forest in 1941. So it seems like the AP passed on this, but this photo was also distributed by Wide World, which is the New York Times photo service at the time, and some other news agencies. But the interesting thing is that the New York Times did not publish this in their own newspaper, which I think is interesting to note. But this is an important picture. And here's an example of Louis Flachner. He relentlessly chronologued what was taking place to the Jews, and in October 41, he wrote about the total elimination of Jews in Europe pressed by Hitler, about the mass deportations on cattle cars, them going to the east and not knowing where they were going. Many suicides are spoken in Jewish circles. So this was a complete surprise to us. one of the AP journalists in Berlin, Ernest Fisher, we saw his private diary in the Wisconsin Historical Society, and there were like anti-Semitic comments in there about setting up a KKK chapter to deal with the Jewish problem. He was, and we write about, you'll have to read the book, about stories about how he covered these Holocaust issues. He was right outside Babi Yar when the massacre took place, and we have a whole item about how he covered it. So it's chilling to read Fisher's diary entries and to know that he served in an AP bureau where the story of the plight of Jews was so central. So one of the surprises of the book with the Holocaust is how central that the Soviets were in unveiling the Holocaust, because they took over they were taking over land from the Nazis and revealing mass atrocities, killings that were taking place. This was in February 42. There was 7,500 Jews in Kirsch. Even though they weren't mentioned in the captions, this was like the first visual evidence confirming the atrocities of the Holocaust. At the Holocaust Museum, they have an exhibition, Americans in the Holocaust. They have a panel that says "Mass Murder Confirmed," and they shout out the AP in November 1942 that it was the AP that reported first that 2 million Jews were exterminated in Europe, and also the Hitler was going after to do a total elimination of the Jews. So this was in 1942, and as Anne mentioned, the play and papers were ranged. So in many papers it was page 1. This is the LA Times. It was on page 4. The Washington Post, it was page 6. The New York Times, it was page 10. And in the Atlanta Constitution, it only merited to appear on the page where the railway schedules and help wanted ads were on page 20. Now, on that day, November 25th, 42, when AP revealed the mass murder, or confirmed the mass murder campaign that the State Department confirmed, AP also had this story out of London about the Jews that were killed in Poland. But what was significant in there is that AP was reporting that special camps at Treblinka, the death camps at Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, the Jews were sent there where they were mass murdered. So this is already in the public discourse in November of 42. AP's Eddie Gilmore was allowed by the Soviets to visit the Babi Yar when they retook it from the Nazis. Babi Yar is near Kiev, the site of 32,000 Jews that were killed, and he interviewed the Soviet soldiers that were forced to dig up the bodies, and it's a very moving article. This is Majdanek, the liberation. The Soviets liberated the Majdanek camp. It was the first death camp that was liberated, and this was like 7 months before the Americans liberated. Our consciousness of the atrocities is when Eisenhower invited the press over to document what was the atrocities at Buchenwald, Dachau, but it was first revealed here in July and August by the Soviet journalists, and then they invited the AP in there. AP's Dan DeLuce, who wrote about the crematoria there, the gas chambers there. And this is in August of 1944, which is significant because this is also the time when there was a debate within the American administration of whether to bomb the railway lines leading up to Auschwitz or Auschwitz itself. So this put it out there that these the mass extermination, the visual evidence was out there when this debate was taking place. This is interesting. This is when the Soviets liberated Auschwitz, the only image that they provided the Western press was this picture of an emaciated old man. Unfortunately, they did not provide photos of, well, the Nazis destroyed, I believe, all of the infrastructure with, the gas chambers and the crematoria, but there were other compelling pictures, like thousands of abandoned suitcases, teeth and gold, and many things that they could have used to illustrate what was going on. But this was a picture that AP transmitted. It was provided to other news organizations of what was going on at Auschwitz, and it was kind of like a missed opportunity because there was more compelling photography at the time. So here's an example of this wasn't available during while the Holocaust was taking place to the public. This was taken by a Jewish prisoner who snuck a picture of in Birkenau of Jewish bodies being burnt after getting out of the crematoria. But this was not available, unfortunately. And it really boiled down to visuals because, like Anne said, these stories were beyond belief. During World War I, there were a lot of these stories of atrocities which turned out not to be true. And we didn't have the compelling visual evidence. Here's an example when the Allies liberated the camp in Dachau, where they invited the civilians to see what the Germans actually did. And here's Joseph Pulitzer. Eisenhower invited the press, and the AP distributed a lot of the publishers and editors who went to Germany. But he said, but it was significant for him because he said, I came here in a suspicious frame of mind, feeling that I would find that many terrible reports that have been printed in the U.S. before I left were exaggerations and largely propaganda. And then he says, it was the photographs of this bestiality that had the greatest impact and told the true story. If the reader is still skeptical, let him look at the photographs, and when he does so, let him remember that they picture only small parts of the mosaic of the Nazi policy of deliberate mass extermination. Okay. Oh. Okay. Okay, so one of our so one of the controversial things when AP was kicked out of Germany, and the AP continued to have a photo exchange with the Nazis. So the AP, we found these declassified files on Hermann Lachs, who operated this photo exchange for Germany, and had this relationship with the AP of exchanging thousands of photos during the war. Here's one of the photos. So a number of these photos do have news value. Here's one of Hitler and Mussolini. And at the time, when the AP went to AP to get permission for this, like here's the Office of Censorship said that, these, and they green-lighted the project. They said, oh, these can be of informative value to us. But what AP neglected to tell the US government was who was behind this photo exchange. They didn't mention Lachs, they didn't mention his SS affiliation, and they didn't mention that the Foreign Office was involved. And it led to an investigation by Army investigators who contemplated charging the AP with that perhaps they were in violation of the Trading with the Enemy Act. And this is the Joe Morton. He is the only American journalist that was executed by the Nazis, and it's important that we remember him. And that's the photo presentation.
Thank you,
Okay,
Randy. Thank you so much.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
And thank you for showing this photo of Joe Morton. His story is quite tragic and very intriguing, in fact. And I'm gonna ask before we get to Q&A, maybe Anne, if you could maybe tell us a little more about the tragic story of Joe Morton, the journalist.
Sure. So Morton was a war correspondent for AP. He was not based in the Berlin bureau, but during the war, he traveled all over Eastern Europe, kind of a dashing risk taker. He made friends with guys in the OSS, the precursor of the CIA, and that enabled him, for example, to be in Romania right after it was liberated by the Soviet army. He was the only American correspondent, or the only Western correspondent there to cover that story. That's the kind of thing that he really specialized in. I'm going to be there first. I'm going to get the story and I'm going to bring it to people with all the color and drama. And his stories were full of color and drama. And then in September of 1944, he's still in Europe, still a war correspondent. He calls his bureau chief in Rome and says, I have the opportunity to go cover the story of a lifetime. And I can't tell you a lot about it because it's a secret mission. But he did say he was going into Slovakia with the OSS. They were going to fly in over German lines, so they would be landing in territory that was mostly controlled by Nazis, but they'd be landing in an area, a town that was actually held by partisans, Slovakian partisans. And the Slovakian partisans had been sheltering Allied pilots who'd been shot down, during the war. So this mission is going in to rescue those pilots and get them out to safety. It's also taking in arms to the Slovakian partisans to help promote them having an uprising against the Nazis. So Joe Morton flies in with the OSS on this mission. He had promised his bureau chief he'd be on the first flight back out. He didn't do that. He decided, apparently, this story is so amazing, this partisan uprising, how brave, and I'm going to be here and I'm going to cover it. Well, unfortunately, he stayed on, and the Nazis started surrounding the town where the partisans were, this little bit of land that they had controlled. So they, in October, November, I guess, they have to flee. So the partisans, all the civilians there, Joe Morton, the OSS, and there was some British intelligence there. They flee into the Tatra Mountains, and it's getting to be winter. It's icy cold. People are literally freezing to death. They have very little food. They're running east in hopes that they will run into the Soviet army, who were our allies, of course, at that time, and then they'll be safe. So around Christmas time, 1944, Morton and the OSS people take shelter in a hunting lodge in these mountains. And the day after Christmas, some of them went out to forage for food. The rest of them are still in the lodge when they are surrounded by Nazis and Slovakians who were supporting the Nazis. They're captured. They're taken to the Nazi concentration camp in Mauthausen, Austria. And not too long after they're interrogated and tortured there, orders come from Berlin, execute all of them. So the OSS guys, Joe Morton, are executed. AP doesn't know what's happened to him for months. The story is finally unraveled at the end of the war when an AP correspondent, the father of my late husband actually, was sent to investigate. He went to Mauthausen, found a Polish Jew who had been imprisoned there, who had dog tags of one of the OSS people. So, he said, yes, they were here. I saw them. He had witnessed the executions. They were taken one at a time into a room and told, we need to take a picture of you. And then once they were in the room, they were shot in the back of the head. And this former prisoner was tasked with removing their bodies, getting rid of any blood on the floor before the next victim was brought in to be executed. And so Joe Morton probably is the only correspondent, period, who was executed by the Nazis. We know for certain he's the only American, but a very tragic story.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, that's very
many millions
yes.
of tragic stories.
Yeah, and a credit to Larry's father who uncovered the fate of Joe Morton, what happened to him, and it also underscores how the dangers that reporters face when they enter war zones. So thank you for recounting that. Okay, so we have some questions coming in, and this first one I see is for Randy. He is asking, this question is asking about the fate of the Jewish photographers who worked for the AP. Randy, will you talk about that?
Yeah. So the AP had 6 Jewish staffers with the Jewish photo service, 4 men and 2 women. In 35, they were forced to dismiss them, to let them go, because they were following the laws in Germany that you had to be you couldn't be Jewish to continue. But the AP did transfer some of them outside of Germany. Their senior photographer, Jacobson, they sent to Austria, and he was the bureau chief there up and through the Anschluss in 38. And then he went to Czechoslovakia, and then he went back to Berlin, but there was no work for him because he couldn't work. And then it's interesting to see if he took those photos during Kristallnacht. But one very fascinating anecdote about the Jewish employees is that Franz Roth had taken some pictures. He was by the propaganda ministry when Germany invaded France. He took pictures that France was back to normal under the Nazis, and these photos were distributed, a number of them by AP. But what was fascinating and gave satisfaction to these Jewish employees who had left and were dismissed is that they had gotten out some smuggled pictures that contradicted Roth's and Germany's claim that things were getting better in France. And the AP published these photographs of these former Jewish employees, I'm sure giving them much satisfaction. The AP did help the employees get settled, and they all survived the war. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Randy. So we have another question here, and I'll give it to both of you. I'll address it to both of you. The question is, to what extent did AP know and write about the victims of the Holocaust, such as Roma and Sinti and the communists? So in other words, the non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust.
That's a great question, Randy. You probably know more about that than I do. It's certainly, it comes up in AP stories, but the focus was very much on, the laws against Jews, stripping them of their rights, stripping them of their property, the assaults on them. So I think that was kind of the preponderance of the coverage.
When there was a Berlin Dateline, when the bureau operated in Germany, there wasn't much about like the atrocities that took place in the concentration camps. That kind of like pushed the envelope, and I believe that AP and other news organizations were aware of it, but they held back for fear of retribution. There were 40 journalists that were expelled during the first 5 years when the Nazis took over. There was a ban on communications with the AP in 35 because they disliked some stories that the AP put out. So there was clearly issues where the media didn't report certain things because of fear of retribution. But once the war started, I haven't seen any articles relating to those victims, unfortunately. That's something I'll look into it though. I mean, it's an interesting question.
Thank you, Randy. Yeah, and we should mention, as every time we mention the Holocaust, we should mention, in addition to 6 million Jews, 5 million non-Jews murdered for their beliefs, for their lifestyles, for what they were, for their culture, religion, etc. So those victims should never be forgotten. Let's see, Randy, I have another question for you. What does the sign say in your first slide? I don't remember what your first slide was.
Oh, yeah.
Lawyer.
That was the boycott of, oh, the sign, okay. Of the Jew being paraded in the
Right.
streets.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so that he was just
It's believed that it said something like, "I will never come to the police again." But it wasn't, and I think, Randy, the image that you showed, some newspapers kind of doctored it, or not, I mean,
yeah.
in good faith, they were, trying to make it darker so that it was readable. I think it was the photographer who said years later, that's what I remember being on there. "I will never, come to the police again."
Hmm.
But in the original photograph, apparently it's not terribly legible.
Yeah, this was a Jewish lawyer who had gone to the police to file a complaint on behalf of a Jewish client, and the police beat this lawyer up and forced him to parade around the street with this sign on him saying that he would never come to police, he would never file a complaint with the police again.
And that
But
was
that's
the photo. That was the photo that Louis Lochner said, we're not going to buy this. It was taken by a German who had trouble. He couldn't sell it to any German media at that point. He came to AP and Lochner said, "No, thank you." Lochner's editor, when it was sold then to another American agency and it appeared in some US papers, Lochner's editors were apoplectic. How could you pass up this? And this was like one of the first times that he, started this mantra, we need to stay here. We can't get thrown out. We're AP. We have 1,200 subscribers. If we're gone, what news will there be? Yes, we're restricted, but we can, we do what we can within the restrictions to report.
Yeah. So the photograph of that on page 1 of the Jewish lawyer being paraded, in the caption, it does say, like Ann said, that he's bearing a placard saying, "I'll never complain to the police again."
Yeah.
Yeah. And that anecdote is I'll just take this opportunity to show the book Newshawks in Berlin. It does that anecdote is there's more detail on that in this book, and and there's link to get the book if you're interested in more information on that.
But I'd just like to say another fascinating story that AP passed on in 33, a good source of Lochner, who is a Jewish lawyer. He said that the Jewish lawyers have gotten together and they were contemplating a mass suicide of 500 Jewish single lawyers, but they decided against it because the control of the Nazi media was so great that the world would not know of what would have transpired. That was the fear that the Jews had in Germany at the time, and of the control of the German media. But we recount that story in the book about the Jewish lawyers contemplating mass suicide.
Yeah, thank you.
This all starts to sound a little schizophrenic, like he turned down that picture, but then, he reported these other stories, and their reporting on Kristallnacht was detailed and lengthy. although Lochner said, yeah, we didn't actually report the very, very worst of Kristallnacht. And it just, Lochner wrote and talked about this afterwards and, how decisions were made. But, they're making them every single day under a lot of pressure. And so I guess it's kind of understandable that it comes out looking like, well, but you did this on Thursday, and then on Saturday you did something, seemingly a very different kind of decision. It must have been incredibly difficult.
Thank you, Anne. Do we have time for one more question, Sydney, or do we need to wrap it up?
Yeah, no, we have time for one more.
Okay. So we have one audience member asking about if we have any information on Goebbels's relationship with the Associated Press reporters or any other forum reporters.
Well, he and Lochner, you probably saw that picture early on in Randy's presentation of Lochner and Goebbels. They definitely had a relationship because Lochner had to, this is what he needed to, if he wanted to try to keep the Bureau open in Germany and not get everybody thrown out, he needed to court to some degree, the government officials like Goebbels. Later, though, Randy, maybe you remember this, there's something, is it in Goebbels's diaries where he says some not very nice things about Lochner?
I think that was the caption that we have on that picture with him.
Yeah, I don't remember what it was, but clearly, he was, there was a veneer, I guess, over the relationship. And what each of them thought internally or in private was rather different from that picture, that smiling picture that you saw early in the presentation.
Yeah, we write in the May 1942 entry, Goebbels, apparently offended by things Lochner reported after his expulsion from Germany, wrote that Lochner is behaving in an especially contemptible way. His attacks are directed above all against German propaganda, and he aims at me personally. I have never thought much of Lochner.
Yeah, but he may have written that, in a fit of anger about some particular story. And also, Lochner and the other correspondents were able to travel before the US and Germany went to war against each other. They were able to travel into some war zones, into Poland after the invasion, but it was always under German escort. And they were criticized for that. Newspaper editors, some of those 1,200 subscribers, they would complain to Kent Cooper at AP, what are you guys doing? You're traveling with the Nazi army. What do you expect to see? Well, Lochner could, he used, I think it was his first trip into Poland, where, he wrote about, yes, the military action was very impressive in the sense of, moving very quickly and just, flattening everything. But he also wrote about the lines of refugees and, the dire situation for the civilians on the ground, which was something that he wasn't going to see if he didn't go on that escorted trip. This is still an issue today for journalists, in war zones. Like to get to that front, you got to have a military escort. You have to follow rules, but you keep your eyes open. You be transparent about the circumstances and just report, everything that you can see.
Yeah, and Lochner had to intervene with the propaganda ministry because they oversaw pictures, and whenever AP would object to sending a picture according to Nazi dictates, Lochner, as an American citizen, would interface with them and remove the picture, because the repercussions of him removing a picture were completely different from a German citizen who faced a concentration camp or or other serious issues as a German citizen. So you needed to have Lochner as the American citizen interfacing and protecting the integrity of the AP photo captions, which he did.
Sydney, that wraps up our role, I think.
Yes.
Right.
So, I mean, I could listen to you all kind of talk about this all night. It's so interesting. So I'm sorry we cut you off, but I do want to thank all three of you for being here this evening and for this excellent discussion and these excellent presentations as well. I learned a lot, and I know everybody in the audience did as well.